"You're just a waiter," Kevin said, not lifting his gaze. It was said with such disdain, such confidence, that I could barely restrain myself from stepping up to him and hitting him in the face. But I knew that for him, I truly was nothing. He knew that I, to him, was just a shadow, a part of the decor, meant to remain invisible. And this was not the only humiliation. This was the beginning of something that would change everything. I sat at a table in a luxurious restaurant, a place that was a far cry from anything I had ever known. Crystal chandeliers, golden mirrors, expensive tables with snowy white tablecloths, everything around me exuded luxury, a world I had no place in. This restaurant, like all places where Kevin frequented, was where people like him came to feel important. People who lived in a world that was alien to me. And here I was, just a man who poured drinks, delivering food, barely noticeable. My friend Joe had been working here for years, and while he had always been respectful to me, he knew I'd struggled to belong to this world. When I first told him about Lisa's wedding, he didn't hesitate to warn me. He said that Kevin didn't want me at the wedding. That to Kevin, I was just another worker, someone who didn't deserve to be there. Joe had no illusions about how this would go. He told me straight up that I didn't belong in their world, and for a moment I couldn't argue. Kevin was confident, wealthy, and always at the center of attention, while I had nothing but my history of working at low-paying jobs. Joe was right. I was not equal to Kevin. I had no wealth, no power, no influence. I was nothing more than an invisible figure in the world Kevin inhabited, and I had spent most of my life feeling like I was standing on the sidelines. But Lisa, my daughter, had invited me. She wanted me there, and no matter what I thought of Kevin and his world, I couldn't just stay away. She was my daughter, and this was her day. I knew it wouldn't be easy. I would feel out of place, like I didn't belong. Kevin would most likely look at me with disdain. It was going to be hard. But I couldn't back out. I couldn't leave her alone on her wedding day. She wanted me there, and that meant more than anything. I had to be by her side, no matter how uncomfortable it made me feel. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. I had no choice. I had to be there, even if I was just a shadow, standing on the periphery. Even if I was invisible to everyone around me. What mattered was that I was there for Lisa. I was her father, and that was all that mattered. As I sat in the restaurant, listening to the laughter and chatter of people around me, I felt the weight of the decision pressing on me. But at the same time, I knew I had already made it. Yes, it would be hard. Yes, I would feel like an outsider. But I would be there. That's what counted. I couldn't leave Lisa. No matter what. I looked up and saw Joe standing by the door. He nodded at me, understanding that I had made up my mind. I knew he knew how difficult this would be for me, but he also knew I was doing the right thing. I had to do this. It was my duty as a father, and I couldn't avoid it. I would be there for Lisa. That was all that mattered. The process of preparing for Lisa's wedding consumed more and more of my thoughts. I knew the wedding day was getting closer, and the anxiety in my chest wouldn't subside. While I wasn't there yet, in this world that Lisa would now live in, it was easier to hide my fears and anxieties. But I knew I was going to be at her wedding, and I understood that I would be surrounded by people who saw me as nothing more than part of the background. When Lisa invited me, she expected me to be there with her. But I increasingly felt myself becoming part of something that didn't belong to me. At her wedding, everything would go by Kevin's rules, and I, most likely, would remain in the shadows, unnoticed by everyone, even by Lisa herself. But I couldn't bring myself to refuse. I was her father. And I had to be there with her, despite everything. I didn't know how to act at this event. I couldn't be in the spotlight because Kevin and his friends wouldn't even notice me. I felt that it would be difficult for me to be among people who would look at me like I didn't belong. When I thought about it, it only made things worse. Everyone around me would be so confident, so successful. I, on the other hand, had always been in the background, the one who, despite his efforts, never managed to find his place. But how could I not be with Lisa? She needed my support, even if I had to remain invisible among them. At some point, the idea came to me, if I worked as a waiter, it would be easier for me to stay unnoticed. It wasn't an ideal solution. But if I could be near Lisa, helping out, serving drinks, moving among the guests without drawing attention to myself, I would still be part of her day. This gave me some peace, as I couldn't just stand on the sidelines. Lisa was my daughter, and I had to be with her. Becoming a waiter wasn't a perfect solution, but it gave me a chance to be part of the wedding. I could be near Lisa, but stay in the background, not interfering with her celebration. I could help, be part of everything, but not make her worry about how uncomfortable I felt. It was hard to stand aside and watch everyone enjoy themselves while I remained unnoticed. But I knew that I would be there, and that was enough. Lisa shouldn't have to worry about how I felt while she was the center of attention. My inner conflict continued to grow, but this decision gave me some relief. I was ready to remain in the shadows, to be part of her day, even though to everyone else, I would just be part of the background. I didn't want Lisa to feel like I wasn't there, like I had abandoned her. I was her father, and my role was to support her, even if no one would notice how difficult it was for me to be there. So I made up my mind. I would be a waiter at the wedding, and that would be my role. I would be with her, but I wouldn't interfere with her happiness. I didn't want to be a distraction. I just wanted to be there, to let Lisa know that I was here. That was what mattered. The day before the wedding, Lisa came to see me. I wasn't expecting it, but when she walked into the room, I could see the worry in her eyes. She was trying to keep herself together, but her nervousness was evident. She didn't say it right away, but I knew that her anxiety was not just about the wedding itself, but also about the growing tension between her father and her fiancé. She sat down next to me, and I felt the tension between us become almost palpable. She wasn't saying what she was thinking, but I could see in her eyes that her worries went beyond just the wedding. She was worried about how I would feel around all these people, in this new world, where I wasn't part of high society. And yet she was becoming an inseparable part of it. I remained silent, unsure of what to say. The truth was, I didn't need to say anything. Lisa already knew how I felt. She could see that I didn't find my place among these people. She knew that I felt like a stranger in this world, like the doors were open for everyone but me. She looked at me with worry and tenderness. I could see how much she cared about me, but also about herself. She knew the wedding was her day, but it was important to her that I was there, that I didn't feel out of place. She didn't want me to be alone on this day. For her, that mattered more than all the luxury and the focus on the wedding itself. I felt her concern, but at the same time, I realized how much things had changed between us. Not long ago, I was the one supporting her, and now she had come to me to comfort me, to reassure me that I mattered to her on this day, despite everything. But it was clear that I would remain an observer, in the background, playing my role but no more than that. We sat in silence, and I could see her anxiety growing. She couldn't relax because everything going on around her overshadowed her own happiness. She was worried about me, about how I would feel, about how this day would be for me. I could see her heart racing, her lips slightly trembling, but she didn't speak of her fears. I knew that I wouldn't be able to be among people who didn't understand me, who didn't treat me as an equal. I knew that I wouldn't be able to be part of this celebration without feeling like an outsider. I would simply be someone standing in the corner, unnoticed and unnecessary. But for her, I was important. I was her father, and that was enough for me. My role on this day wasn't to be in the spotlight, but I would still remain her support, as I always had. I looked at Lisa and felt my heart tighten. I couldn't allow myself to leave, to not be there for her, despite everything I was feeling. I was her father, and that was more important than anything else. We sat in silence, but in that silence, there were so many unspoken words. I knew she was waiting for me, and I couldn't let her down. Even if this day would be difficult for me, I would be by her side. From the very start, the wedding felt like a dream: grandeur, luxury, gleaming chandeliers, and exquisite furniture. Guests in elegant attire, with smiles and pleasant conversations, created an atmosphere of celebration where everything seemed in its place. Lisa was at the center of this world, glowing like never before. Her happiness was apparent, and everyone around her, including Kevin, seemed to be naturally part of her new, carefree future. I stood aside, quietly playing my part, trying not to attract attention. I wasn't there to be part of the festivities, but to remain in the shadows beside her. My role was invisible, and I had nothing to do except quietly watch what was happening. Every glance at Lisa reminded me why I was there. But inside, I was growing more and more lost, feeling like I didn't belong. I could feel the tension rising around me as the atmosphere filled with an invisible weight. Conversations about business, travel, and real estate. Kevin, sitting at the center of it all, was impossible to miss. He didn't hide his sense of superiority. His confidence radiated, and everyone's attention was focused on him as the leader of this world. He spoke about his successes, about how much he had achieved, as though his place here was not just earned, but expected. I couldn't ignore his arrogance, the way he made it clear that he was above everyone, even those working the wedding. He continued to speak to the guests, paying little attention to those around him, treating them as if they were beneath him. And that's when I realized, once again, that I would be noticed. I was just a waiter. No matter how hard I tried to remain invisible, I couldn't shake the feeling that I didn't belong here. When Kevin approached me, his gaze was cold, almost disdainful. There was something in his eyes that made me feel even smaller. He didn't know how hard it was for me, how difficult it was to be here among all these people who were part of his world. But he knew I wasn't his equal. He knew I was just an outsider, and I could feel it. At that moment, Kevin loudly addressed the guests, wanting to demonstrate his superiority. With a mocking tone, he said, "Look at our staff. This man is just a waiter, let's not forget that." He said it loudly so everyone could hear, with such contempt that everyone present felt the sting of his words. For a moment, everything around me froze. I felt my blood rush from my face, my breath becoming shallow, as this humiliating phrase sank into my heart. I didn't have to say anything, I just stood there, holding back my emotions, trying not to show how deeply it hurt. But inside I felt the pain. This wasn't just an insult. It was a confirmation that I didn't belong here, that I was an outsider among all these people who lived by different rules. I stayed calm, but inside, I was seething. I was part of this wedding, but not part of their world. I was simply an observer, someone who was meant to stay in the background. And despite all my efforts to stay unnoticed, Kevin made me visible, but not as an equal. He showed everyone who I really was. But I couldn't let myself give up. I was her father, and that meant more than anything. I couldn't turn away, I couldn't leave. I stayed in the shadows, but I was with Lisa, and that was enough for me. Nothing else mattered. Lisa's wedding continued, and I found myself back in my place, officially, with trays and drinks in hand. But this time, everything was different. Kevin's words, his public humiliation, had already shattered my anonymity. Despite my desire to remain unnoticed, I could still feel the eyes of the guests, piercing me because of what Kevin had done. I was part of this event, but now I wasn't just a waiter, I was the one he had humiliated. I had become what they saw me as after that incident. I knew that my attempts to remain unnoticed would no longer succeed. I was forced to keep doing my job, but every step, every glance from the guests made me feel like I was becoming part of their foreign world. I still carried the drinks, helped with the appetizers, but now I knew I was no longer just a waiter in their eyes. I was the one who had been put in his place. But despite this, I wasn't going to reveal my secret. I didn't want my past as an actor to define me in front of them. At that moment, I felt an increasing urge to preserve my identity, to leave everything behind, despite no longer being seen as just the waiter. I was someone else before, yes, but now that didn't matter. No one knew I was once a famous actor. No one knew I had lived in another world, a world filled with cameras and lights. Now they only saw me here and now, as part of their world, as someone they could belittle or ignore. I wasn't going to reveal that part of my life. I understood that if they found out who I had been, it would only complicate things. I would become an even greater object of ridicule. I kept performing my role. I tried to forget what Kevin had said, how he had humiliated me in front of everyone. But inside, everything was boiling. This wasn't just an insult. It was a confirmation that I wasn't who I had once been. But despite all of this, I kept going. I couldn't leave. I was her father, and despite everything happening around me, I had to be there for Lisa. I knew I couldn't reveal my secret because it would only hinder me from being with her. I didn't need to go back to that world. I chose to be here with my daughter, and that was enough. I continued serving drinks, more and more often noticing the guests' stares, but I didn't back down. I was here for Lisa, no matter what was going on. In the atmosphere of the celebration, I noticed that something began to change. The guests were starting to pay more attention to me. At first, it was just quick glances, almost unnoticed, but then I began to feel their growing interest. They had noticed that I wasn't just a waiter, that I was someone much more significant than just part of the background. This started to visibly unsettle Kevin. He still tried to maintain his confidence, smiling and staying at the center of attention, but I saw how his gaze became tense. He continued to engage with the guests, but every time our eyes met, I could feel him tense up. There was a flicker of anxiety in his eyes, though he tried to mask it with his usual arrogance. He kept showing everyone how successful he was, how much he had achieved, but I knew that his confidence was beginning to crack. He couldn't allow anyone to shift their attention away from him and onto me. I saw Kevin getting more nervous when someone in his circle unintentionally started asking about me, why I was here, at this wedding, why I wasn't at the center of attention, but working in this role. Of course, he tried to brush off the question, diverting everyone's attention back to his own success, but I noticed the momentary dullness in his face. He was trying to stay calm, but I could tell that his assurance was starting to falter. He couldn't hide it from me. At one point, as I simply passed by, he looked at me in such a way that I understood. He felt like he was losing control. He didn't know what to do, didn't know how to react to the fact that his world was starting to crack. He was ready to do whatever it took to regain control, but despite his confidence, I knew he was no longer as invincible as he wanted to appear. I kept playing my role, not letting on how his tension affected me. I stayed close to Lisa, doing my job, but internally, I could feel how my presence, my movements, my gaze were starting to affect Kevin. He tried to hide his emotions, but I saw how his calmness was slowly slipping away. It wasn't easy. I knew that my role wasn't as simple as it seemed at first. But despite everything, I kept acting the way I had decided. I was part of this world, but I was no longer just a waiter. I was the one who held the gaze, the one who made people, including Kevin, feel like they were losing control. The wedding continued, and everything seemed to be going smoothly, until one of Dan's old acquaintances recognized him. I didn't expect anyone to recognize me in this crowd, especially since I was trying so hard to stay in the background, playing my part. But suddenly, among the guests, I felt someone hesitate for a moment, and then their gaze lingered on me. A man in his 50s, with clear signs of old familiarity on his face, approached me. At first, I didn't recognize him, but his eyes gave it away. He was someone I had once worked with in a film. He was one of those who witnessed my time as a famous actor. He didn't speak immediately, but his eyes said it all. I felt the surprise flash in his eyes, followed by realization. He quietly said to me, "It can't be. Is that you, Dan?" His voice full of surprise and respect, as though he was shocked but simultaneously happy to see me here. I didn't know what to say or how to respond. I'd been trying to hide from my past, but it had caught up with me. At that moment, I realized that my desire to stay hidden, to keep everything from the past a secret, no longer mattered. The guests started noticing how this interaction was unfolding. They saw how the man, who had been part of our old days, became more attentive and even slightly respectful. I felt the way their gazes changed. They were no longer just curious, there was respect in their eyes. I didn't have to explain anything. One look, one recognition, and I was no longer the person I had wanted to stay. I was visible. I wasn't just a waiter anymore. I was a person with a history, with a past that suddenly became important. Kevin, who had been trying to maintain his position at the center of attention, saw the shift. I could see how his confidence began to waver. He tried to keep up the act, smiling, but I knew he felt like he was losing control. He was still talking to the guests, but his tension was visible. He tried to ignore what was happening, to keep his image intact, but it wasn't as easy anymore. The guests started looking at me with respect, and Kevin noticed it. He tried to carry on as though nothing had changed, but I could see his confidence cracking. He realized he had made a mistake, that he had let his arrogance get the better of him and humiliated me in front of everyone. He began to understand that his attempts to control the situation were failing. But I wasn't going back to that world. I didn't want to be a part of that time anymore. I was here for Lisa, and that was all that mattered. However, despite everything, the recognition of my past shifted the atmosphere. The guests now respected me, and Kevin, though still trying to save face, knew he couldn't stay in the position he had once held. The wedding continued, and the atmosphere began to shift. As I stood among the guests, watching everything unfold, I felt the growing tension start to fade. The guests kept laughing, talking, and enjoying themselves, but something in their looks had changed. They no longer viewed me with the same judgment they had before. Kevin, too, seemed to realize that his control over the situation was slipping. His confidence, once unshakable, now appeared much more fragile. He avoided making eye contact with me, keeping his distance as if unsure of what to say or how to act. He kept up his position at the center of attention, but it was clear that something had shifted in the way he saw me. I could feel his gaze following me, and finally, he couldn't hold back any longer. He approached me, and I saw how his face had lost some of its usual confidence. He didn't speak loudly, but I could hear his words clearly. He acknowledged his mistake. He finally realized he had been wrong. It wasn't easy for him, and I could tell how hard it was for him to admit. He apologized to me, directly and sincerely, for everything that had happened, for the humiliating words and actions I had endured. His voice was serious, and though he tried to keep his pride intact, I felt a real sincerity in his words. I stood there silently, not knowing what to say. I didn't need loud words, I didn't need grand apologies. What mattered was that he understood his mistake and finally realized how much his actions had hurt me. I nodded at him, and that was enough. Lisa, who had been standing off to the side, watching us, probably realized the full extent of what had happened. She, like me, didn't know how to react, but her gaze was filled with new understanding. I saw her begin to realize that, despite all the difficulties, I had always been there for her. I had been her support, no matter what we had been through. And that meant more than anything. When Kevin stepped back, I felt the tension in the room ease. There were no loud cheers or applause, but it felt like a sense of peace had returned to the wedding, maybe not perfect, but sincere. I stood beside Lisa, and at that moment, that was all that mattered to me. The wedding continued, and the atmosphere began to shift. As I stood among the guests, watching everything unfold, I felt the growing tension start to fade. The guests kept laughing, talking, and enjoying themselves, but something in their looks had changed. They no longer viewed me with the same judgment they had before. Kevin, too, seemed to realize that his control over the situation was slipping. His confidence, once unshakable, now appeared much more fragile. He avoided making eye contact with me, keeping his distance as if unsure of what to say or how to act. He kept up his position at the center of attention, but it was clear that something had shifted in the way he saw me. I could feel his gaze following me, and finally, he couldn't hold back any longer. He approached me, and I saw how his face had lost some of its usual confidence. He didn't speak loudly, but I could hear his words clearly. He acknowledged his mistake. He finally realized he had been wrong. It wasn't easy for him, and I could tell how hard it was for him to admit. He apologized to me, directly and sincerely, for everything that had happened, for the humiliating words and actions I had endured. His voice was serious, and though he tried to keep his pride intact, I felt a real sincerity in his words. I stood there silently, not knowing what to say. I didn't need loud words, I didn't need grand apologies. What mattered was that he understood his mistake and finally realized how much his actions had hurt me. I nodded at him, and that was enough. Lisa, who had been standing off to the side, watching us, probably realized the full extent of what had happened. She, like me, didn't know how to react, but her gaze was filled with new understanding. I saw her begin to realize that, despite all the difficulties, I had always been there for her. I had been her support, no matter what we had been through. And that meant more than anything. When Kevin stepped back, I felt the tension in the room ease. There were no loud cheers or applause, but it felt like a sense of peace had returned to the wedding, maybe not perfect, but sincere. I stood beside Lisa, and at that moment, that was all that mattered to me. As the evening came to an end and the guests began to leave, I felt the tension that I had carried with me throughout the day start to fade. All the conversations died down, and only a soft silence remained in the hall, carrying a faint sadness. It was a moment when there was no longer any need to pretend that everything was under control. Lisa approached me, and I saw how she looked at me carefully. In her eyes there was not just gratitude, but something deeper, the realization that her father had always been there for her. She didn't say it out loud, but I felt that she finally understood how much my support meant to her, despite everything that had happened in our lives. My efforts had not been in vain. That moment, when Lisa was silent, but her gaze spoke volumes, was important to me. I had always known that she appreciated me, but only now, after everything we had been through, did I understand how deeply she had realized my presence in her life. I hadn't been perfect, and there had been many difficult moments, but I had been with her, and that was enough. She looked at me in a way that made it clear that no words were needed. She understood that I had always been there, despite all the challenges, despite my own struggles. We had been through so much, but in that moment, I realized that our bond had not been broken. She understood that what mattered was not just being there, but remaining true to myself despite all the hardships. I didn't know what to say in response, because everything had already been said through her eyes and actions. We stood silently, but the feeling that she had realized my value was enough. In that moment, I felt that everything I had done, all the effort, was not in vain. Lisa understood that I had always been her support, and that was enough. From the moment she approached me, I noticed how everything around us began to settle. It was no longer about disagreements, about what could have torn us apart. We were there, standing face to face, and this moment was important not only to her, but to me as well. In her understanding, there was no room for doubt. I knew that every step I had taken for her had been part of her journey, and she, in turn, had become part of my world. We embraced again. This gesture was simple but full of meaning. It was a reconciliation that required no words, because it was found in our actions, in those moments when we both understood each other without the need for further explanation. At some point, as the wedding came to a close, I realized that, despite all the tension and difficulties, this day had been a turning point for Lisa and me. It was a moment when we became those who had always been there for each other, despite everything. Despite all the trials, I realized that being with Lisa was not just my duty, but my true purpose. She knew that I would always be there for her, and this realization became the most important part of our reconciliation. I stood next to her, and the world around us seemed less important. In that moment, amidst all the guests and the wedding, the most important thing was this moment of reconciliation and the realization that, despite all the pain and challenges, We had found each other again.